We're so glad you've joined us on the ERLC podcast to explore how the Bible addresses important cultural issues pertaining to life, religious liberty, marriage and family, and human dignity, and how we can walk in wisdom for God's glory and for the flourishing of our neighbors. If you're enjoying this podcast and find it helpful, please leave a review wherever you listen. This will help more people find and benefit from what we're learning together. We are grateful for the time you take to join us for these conversations.
You're listening to the ERLC podcast.
Yeah, well, if you start poking me and Brent, we'll give you a heads
Josh
up
is going to poke
weird.
and I'm going to pinch.
Oh, God.
Man. And I will be back home next week.
Exactly.
Well, hello and welcome back to this week's episode of the ERLC podcast, where every week we're talking about our work here at the ERLC and focusing on what Christians need to know about the things going on in the world. I'm Josh Wester, and actually in the real life studio with me today for the very first time in more than a year are my wonderful co-hosts, Lindsay Nicolay.
Hello, everybody. It's weird that I'm not seeing y'all on screens, that you're actually 3D or 4D people. You're 4D, you're not 3D.
We're 4D.
Yeah, if you were 3D, that would be weird. But it's good to see you.
And Brent Leatherwood is here with us as well.
And yeah, I can reach over and just like pinch you.
Please don't do that. It'll interrupt the podcast.
And we're not wearing masks either.
And there's nothing about green. Like, it's not St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah. So but no, we're not wearing masks, right? Because we're all vaccinated.
Vaxxed and relaxed is what I like to call
Vaxxed
that.
and relaxed. That's
yeah.
real good.
And so we're here. We're able to actually,
Not spread our germs and feel fine about it.
be normal.
Well, I got to tell you, so, we've all been vaccinated, all fully vaccinated. Feels great to be in this place of freedom. And look, clearly the CDC decided last week that it was time for freedom. I'm sure Brent's going to talk to us about that later, so I won't steal all his thunder. But it feels great. Well, so that we can get into it, and though it is incredibly good to be back in the studio and back with you once again, our incredible audience, Lindsay, tell us what the ERLC has been talking about this week.
So those of you who have listened to the podcast, you may remember that we interviewed Carl Trueman about his new book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And we also have an interview series on our site that I've highlighted quite a bit because I just find it so valuable. And I wanted to highlight an interview that we did with Carl Trueman, a print interview by one of our interns and one of our channel editors, Jordan Wootten. And this is just a good one-stop shop if you didn't get a chance to listen to the Carl Trueman interview, to read in his own words a little bit about his new book. And the reason why I think this interview is important is something that Carl Trueman writes in the introduction of his book. And he says, "The task of the Christian is not to whine about the moment in which he or she lives, but to understand its problems and respond appropriately." And that really lines up well with the mission of us here at the ERLC and how we want to equip you as listeners and our readers and us as believers to be able to respond to our cultural moments. So Jordan goes on to ask Carl Trueman questions about his book, about the self, about the sexual revolution, and how our society got here. So if you find yourself just dizzied by the pace of change, especially when it comes to sexuality in our culture, I would highly recommend this interview to you. The next piece that I want to highlight, actually, I was surprised. Jared Kennedy sent it to me, another one of our channel editors, and it's by Ethan and Michaela Holsteen. They have a podcast. And when I scrolled down and was reading the transcript, I know the people that they interviewed because I went to church with them in Louisville, Kentucky. And so the title of this is The Importance of the Church When Dealing with Disability and Grief, How One Family Leaned into Community After Their Child's Diagnosis with Cri-du-Chat Syndrome. And I might not have said that correctly, but Robert and Holly Brookman, when they were having their first child, went in for their ultrasound, their 20-week ultrasound, I presume, and discovered that there were some atypical things that were going on. And their child, Hannah, was diagnosed with this syndrome. And You can imagine first-time parents, they were in their 20s, what they were dealing with. You can imagine how they were reeling and just left questioning things. And what I appreciated about this article is that Robert and Holly share how they were tempted to not tell anybody, and they were tempted to just isolate to themselves and deal with their own grief, but then they were convicted that that's what the church is there for, and that's what community is there for, and they needed to press in to their church community so that they could be supported and be reminded about the truths that they had proclaimed to believe for so long. And when they ran to the church, they found God's promises to be true, and they found a refuge there, and their arms upheld by those who came around them. And so they share Hannah's story, and it's incredible. And if you are dealing with something like this in your family, or just even grief or hard news, I think you will be helped by this article, and you will be spurred on to hope. And then finally, we've been talking about articles by Jared Kennedy, who seems to be the star of the show recently, and he truly is. Josh has said he's just one of his favorite writers when it comes to family and parenting and children's ministry type stuff. And so we're very thankful for Jared and for him being a channel editor with us. But we've been posting a series of things about children and teaching them about sexuality, teaching them about gender, how to prepare them for this day and age in which we live. So this article is titled 3 Subtle Sins to Warn Your Kids About and Why It Matters When Wrestling with Sexual Temptation. And this is convicting, not just if you struggle with sexual temptation or you know someone who does, but it should be convicting in your own heart, in your own life. And I'm just going to read off these things that he tells us we should be teaching our kids about, which we should be teaching ourselves about. And this is beware of discontentment, stop making excuses. And then the third one, beware of sin's empty promises. And he takes this from the book of Jude. And you'll be able to read how he ties these things into how these subtle sins that that Jerry Bridges called respectable sins, how they often lead us down a path to greater sins, and greater in terms of their impact and their consequences. So I would encourage you to turn to this article to check your own heart. I need to check my own heart as well. It's such a helpful article. And this article makes me realize, again, why it's important that we do what we do at the ERLC, because we are called to be salt and light in this culture. And it seems to be an increasingly harder thing to do when faced with our flesh and our temptation and just the muddiness of the situations that we find ourselves in. So we want to spur you on to love and good deeds and to walk faithfully with Christ. And that's what I think these articles will help us do today.
Lindsay, that is just such a helpful rundown, starting with Carl Trueman, who wrote this incredible book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is looking at the sexual revolution, how it got here and where it's taking us, and then our role as Christians and pushing back against, honestly, what is a lot of darkness, to try to preach both the truth of the gospel and about the goodness of God's pattern and design for men and women and human sexuality. Also, highlighting the work of Jared Kennedy is, he is just such a model for what it looks like to think carefully about how to equip the next generation and especially our young children as they are wrestling with questions that in a culture that is very different than the culture that even we grew up in our generation, or our parents or grandparents' generations. They're having to face new questions and challenges. And so if I can, I just want to take a moment of personal privilege. And so listeners, I just appreciate you hanging with me here. One of the things that we're trying to do at the ERLC is we get questions every single day, every single week from people who are confronting questions about their sexuality, about their gender, because of the culture that they live in, this fallen world that we live in. And we are trying to offer those people both biblical truth and the hope of the gospel. And so there were some questions about another article that we had published from an ebook that Jared actually wrote for us on this very topic, talking about these highly charged and debated topics of gender and sexuality to your children. And so we published this article that said, the title was, "What do I do if my child doesn't seem to fit with typical gender norms?" And it was a really, really helpful look at what the Bible says and the wisdom that Scripture can offer us. Because we get questions all the time that sound like this. My child, a parent will email us and say, my child, my son doesn't feel like normal boys. When he looks at some of the activities, the things that other boys his age like to do, he doesn't want to do those things. So he enjoys spending time indoors rather than outdoors. He enjoys cooking rather than going outside to build something. He's averse to fighting or to wrestling, and he enjoys making and creating things. Those kinds of questions come in all the time. What do I tell him? What should I tell him? Should I try to make him embrace those activities? Is that a sign that he's not really the man or the male that God created him to be? Is he somehow deficient in those ways? What is your advice for me? We hear from that angle from parents. We hear from other people all the time who are wrestling with these questions because they, for whatever reason, don't seem to fit into some of the cultural stereotypes that define manhood or womanhood. And what we want to do is answer those people with both biblical truth and the hope of the gospel to be able to help them think biblically about this issue. So when we think about King David in the Bible, we see there a man who wrestled bears and lions and slayed a giant, who was also a poet and a harpist. Now, in our culture, that is not those last two things are not masculine traits. They're not things that you typically associate with manliness. Well, one of the things that we want to say, because what we can say from the Bible is that when we go back to Genesis 1 and we see this pattern, God created them male and female, he created them. We know there are only two sexes. God creates us male or female. And we know that gender is the expression of sex-based traits. We know that your gender is tied to your maleness or femaleness. In other words, gender is tied to sex. But the Bible doesn't constrain us to say, if your son is male, that means he has to like to hunt. That means he has to want you to rub blood on his face or take him outside and punch him or make him roughhouse with you or whatever. Those are not biblically definitive answers to the questions about masculinity. And in the same way, if a little girl embraces some behaviors that you would call tomboyish or that make her seem less feminine, what we want to say to those people, and what Jared says in this article that is so, so helpful, and we really don't want people to miss this, is that if God made you a male, you are a male. And if God made you a female, you are a female. And you don't have to fully conform